to all of you who are here today. And I also want to express my thanks to the board for asking me to come and present to this group. I said to Vic at a little bit ago that I'm going to be talking about from one of the references that documents what I have lived for many years. So I won't try to give you all of that, but I'll hit some highlights and some overall general perspective when working with and assessing persons from any culture. And actually, we talk about multicultural context. Usually that means minorities or non-whites. And I want to say that if one who becomes culturally competent also does a better job of assessment with whites. So, because there are assumptions that we make when we assess someone from our own group. And I have to be constantly aware of that when I assess African Americans. I have to be constantly aware that there are questions that I just assumed and don't ask. So I have to be conscious of it so that I cannot make those assumptions and ask the questions that need to be asked. Assessments in a multicultural context. The first thing I want to talk about is I'm going to follow the outline of the learning objectives that I sent in earlier. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the impact of cultural, ethnic, and racial variables for the assessment, diagnosis, treatment, service delivery, and development outlook for working with culturally diverse populations. I'm going to focus much more on assessment than I will diagnosis and treatment, since we are addressing a group that's primarily tasked with assessing candidates for ministry and members of boards of ordained ministry, since I understand there are some other denominations represented here. So in assessment and delivery of service of diverse populations, there are three factors that impact the interview of a clergy candidate in a cross-cultural situation. One of the references that I'm using, I only put the names of the authors on the slide. The book by these authors is called Handbook of Multicultural Mental Health Assessment and Treatment of Diverse Populations. And this book is filled with all kinds of research, statistical data in working with persons. And one of the things I want to say is that you probably have heard the old adage that statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. So when you look at these statistics, don't become a liar, but rather see them for what they are. They are statistics that give you broad trends of what's happening in a population. But the person sitting in front of you may not fit those statistics at all. For example, I've moved a lot over my career, and every time I go to a new town, a city, I have to get a new physician. And so I walk in, and without doing any tests, the physician assumes that I have diabetes, that I have high blood pressure, and that I have various and sundry other illnesses or conditions that the statistics tell him that African Americans have. They just assume that. And they're ready to start writing prescriptions for high blood pressure and all that stuff. And I said, wait a minute. I want you to do some testing first. So one doctor did some testing. He tested for all of that stuff. And at the end, when he came to give me results, he looked at me and his face, I said, oh my God, he found something really horrible. And I said, what's the matter? Well, what have I got? He said, you're fine. He said, you're fine. He said it 3 times. And I said, your face don't look like I'm fine. And he said, I don't understand it. I said, what don't you understand? He says, you're African American, you're overweight, and yet your blood pressure is normal, you have no signs of diabetes, and you have no whatever the rest of that stuff is. And he said, I don't understand it. And I said, you gotta look at the patient, talk to the patient. If you talk to me, you might understand it. And of course, he didn't talk to me. So at least I had one physician who verbalized that to me. So after that, I went, whenever I encounter a new physician, which I just did not too long ago, I told them to talk to me before you draw conclusions and from the statistics. Because yes, I'm African American, yes, I'm overweight, but why are African Americans have high blood pressure? Why do they have all these other things? It's from a high salt diet. I've been on a salt-free diet my whole adult life. It's from overeating of fat foods. I have been on lean foods my whole adult life. It's from not getting enough nutrition. I have been on vitamins, minerals, and supplements my whole entire adult life. Do you begin to get the picture? So you have to talk to the person rather than rely on what the statistics say. You have to talk to them, regardless to what ethnic group they're from. Many years ago, when I first started out in practice in Virginia, I had a client to come who was of Japanese origin. She was second generation American Japanese. And she said she had been to three other counselors, and I was the 4th one, and none of them could help her. And I said, well, and she said, somebody told me you could help me. And I said, I don't know if I can or not, but I tell you what, I don't know anything about Japanese culture. So if you tell me about your culture, then we'll see if I can help you. And she said, I teach. Interesting. And I said, and I'll learn. And so for the whole, for, 5, 6 sessions, she talked about Japanese culture in America. And then we got into her history of her own history in America. And she came to me because she had family issues, and I talked to the whole family before I started with her, and her family thought she was crazy. All of the clinicians who met with her thought she was crazy. Of course, they didn't use that term. We use these real sophisticated psychological terms. And I looked at her and I says, I don't think you're crazy at all. I think there is something intercultural going on, and I don't know what it is yet, but let's explore it. Well, to cut out all of the middle ground here, it turns out that she was second generation Japanese. She was raised by a first generation Japanese grandmother. She also grew up in the internment camps with all Japanese people speaking Japanese and Japanese culture. Her husband was also second generation, who experienced none of that. He had gotten out into the culture, he was not part of the internment, and he was raised by his parents, not his grandparents. And so after we explored all of that, it turns out that her husband expected her to behave and think like a second generation Japanese person, and she was actually acting and thinking like a first generation. But none of them had that awareness. But it was only after exploring that with her that she understood that awareness. And when it was amazing to watch her face when she became aware of this. She brought her family in, and she and I explained to her family what was going on, and they all went over and gave her this family group hug. It was like if in Japanese culture, if you don't follow the family kind of sets you out on the side. And basically they were saying, welcome into our bosom as a family member, because now they understood what was going on. That's just one example, and there are many, depending on what the culture is. In this case, it was Japanese American, but it could be Latino American, it could be African American, it could be Jewish American, it could be any one of those things. And so having, first of all, listened to the client. My experience in this culture is that Americans, and I had a history teacher tell me this, that one of the problems with America is its arrogance, and think that we know everything. And we are not prone to want to listen to information that we think we already know. And so that is one of the first biases that all of us have to get over, because I also participate in this American bias of arrogance. And that's because I grew up in this country, and most people, again, look at me and think I'm from slavery. None of my family have ever been in slavery. None of my ancestors. And I've checked as far back as I could possibly go. None of them were ever in slavery. So I don't carry with me the internal stuff that African Americans carry whose ancestors were in slavery. But you have to ask me before you know that. You can't look at me and make that assumption. And that's the way it is with a number of others. And I'll go through some of these as I go through my presentation. Every once in a while, I'll do a time check. So when we look at the three factors, you have to look at value differences. What are the value differences? It also means your value, your different, your values and the person you're assessing's values. How are they different? And again, you have to ask your candidate that you're assessing. Autonomy issues. Americans assume self-autonomy. Many cultures do not assume self-autonomy. They're part of a family or part of a community. And the family or community exercises the autonomy. And before they can make major decisions, they have to consult with their family. Well, it's easy to diagnose somebody as being dependent when you see that. Well, if it's part of the family system, maybe it's not dependent. It could be. The person could have a dependent personality, but not because they're relying on their family. So how do you know when it is culture and when it is psychogenic? Well, by talking to the client and by asking the client questions and seeing how it plays out. Because people have an idea. For example, one of the things, and when you talk about autonomy, one of the things that happen when you talk to people, they will tell you they have to rely on their family. If after you talk to them enough for them to get to know you and they know that you are listening to them, if you kind of look at them and look around the room and quietly say, has there been a time when you questioned that? And watch their face light up. If their face don't light up and they say never, then you've got to investigate a little further, because that's an indication you're moving closer to it being psychogenic. But still, don't draw that conclusion until you do some more testing and some more assessment by asking questions. And then there are religious concerns. As all of you know from your studies in psychology, at least mine, since I've studied a long, long time ago, I tell folks I just look young, I'm really old. But back in my day, the schools taught that, that psychology did not deal with religion, that anybody who was religious was either pathological or something close to it. Well, I think that day is moving, we're moving away from that thanks to some of the work in spirituality that's been done at Harvard University and also at GWISH at George Washington University. GWISH, George Washington University Institute for Spiritual Health. We're getting over a lot of that, but at the same time, we still have it present among us, and that is understanding one's religious tradition. And in America, many times, if a person is coming into a United Methodist church to be a minister, or an Episcopal church, or a Nazarene church, or whatever your denomination might be, it also signifies, one, they have been through college, and two, probably through seminary or they are in seminary. So you can assume a certain level of intellect already. And usually they're coming to these denominations either because they grew up in it or because they are seeking a different level of spirituality than their home culture may have taught them. So that's a safe assumption, but don't act on it until you ask them. You know, I always say ask before you act. And so when you have these different religious, if you analyze them and you begin to look at them, you can begin to see how religion helps people survive situations that are difficult, mystical, and hard to understand, and sometimes oppressive, and sometimes even dangerous. And so when you listen to them, also listen for the context. Where did this person originate? And religion has a way of helping keep people safe, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But religion is one of those parts in a tradition or in a culture that helps keep people safe. And so if they're in an environment where they no longer have to be that way, they need coaching, understanding, and insight, and sometimes information to help them move from that place to the next place. And I sometimes hear clinicians say, I don't have time to do that. I don't want to have to get into all of that. They ought to be like the rest of us, meaning whites. And so you have to really have the patience. It really takes patience to work with a person from another culture, regardless, whether you are from the minority culture working with a white person or working with a person outside of your culture, it doesn't matter. It takes patience to work with a person from a different culture than your own. To explore the shift from the old paradigm that places members of a minority group in limited racial and ethnic categories to examine the way that many of these stigmatized individuals belong to more than one minority group, resulting in stigmatization not only outside of their identified primary group, but also within it. And so when you look at this, in the book called Multiculturalism multiple minority identities, applications for practice, research, and training. That's written by Nettles and Balter. When you look at this, you have to see that people, you can't look at someone and assume that they are from a particular culture. For example, you can't look at an Asian person and assume that that they are Asian. They may have Asian biology, and sometimes that's all. What do I mean? There are a lot of Asians who were raised by white parents. They were adopted. And as you know, Chinese, Korean were great markets for childless couples to adopt. And these children grew up. Many of them grew up in these families that cut them off from the original cultural and ethnic and biological identity. And so when they become adults, they come into your office and you assume that this is a Chinese, for example. And when you start treating them like a Chinese, they're looking at you weird, and you come up with some kind of pathological diagnosis because they are not tracking with you. When if asked the question, were you adopted? That's the first question. Were you adopted? And they say yes. By what kind of what racial, ethnic family? They'll tell you that. Now you are starting to get a fix on their psychological identity and cultural identity. Now, the next thing is, were you in touch with your culture growing up, or were you isolated from it? That now tells you something else. And so it doesn't matter whoever you get, assume that they are a minority within a minority. The other thing that happens is that when we talk about racial ethnic minorities, in this culture, it doesn't matter what they look like or what culture they're from, they still may be different depending on what region they're from, how they trace back to their roots. All of that has to do with who they are. And it also means that within the race, there is a lot of discrimination. When I was growing up, there would be people who came, because my father was a pastor and my mother was a missionary, so there were people in and out of our house all the time. And there were those who would come in. My mother had 10 children. And I remember very clearly this woman who came in and said to my mother, who was much lighter than my father, because my mother is a combination of white, Irish, and Native American, Cherokee Indian to be specific. And so the family, they would come in and they would say to her, they look around at all of her children, they'd say, okay, this child is going to have a hard time in life. You might as well give up on him and don't try to teach him very much. This child is going to be very successful because, and what was she going by? The color of our skin. And they had a thing where if you were darker than a paper bag, you were in trouble. And of course, I was one of the ones that were in trouble and would never make it. And fortunately, my mother didn't listen to her. She just nodded her head like a good missionary at the time. But when she left, she said, nobody's going to come here and tell me how to treat my young'uns. Now, anybody who laughs will tell me that you understand that term. That's what we would call in the South, young'uns. And so she said, no one is going to come here and tell me how to do that. And I thank God for the kind of mother I had. And many of the mothers were like that. And so there was discrimination within the race. There was discrimination by class. Are you wealthy, or do you have money or means? You're family professional or not professional? When I got to college, I went to a college that my principal recommended to me that said, because that was the college where professionals, children from professional families went. And even though my parents were church leaders, they were not considered professionals among black people because they had not finished seminary. And so I was told that you would never be able to finish college because your parents never finished college, your grandparents never finished college, and when you trace back to your family, back to post-slavery, they did not have a college or high school education. Therefore, you don't stand a chance. Guess where I went when I got a PhD from the top 10 university in America? I went back to that college to see how they were doing. But mainly I wanted them to see how I was doing. But that's the kind of discrimination that so many people from minority groups face. In New York, there were the Cubans and the Puerto Ricans that were at conflict all the time. Well, not all the time, but many times. The Cubans, let me see if I get this right. The Cubans were not American citizens unless they were born in America, but these were Cubans these are people who immigrated to the U.S. They were not U.S. citizens, but the ones who immigrated to the U.S. from Puerto Rico were U.S. citizens, and so they saw themselves as being better than the ones who were from Cubans. The Cubans knew it and wasn't going to have any part of it. And so you can go through group after group and see these kinds of discriminations. So when this candidate is sitting before you, ask them if there were any discriminations among any other Asians or Latinos or African Americans or Native American, whatever the group is, ask them what kinds of discrimination within the group did they experience, and that's going to give you some indications. All right, moving along here as I watch this clock. To explore looking outside the standard assessment instruments design and their interpretations to new models, instruments, and interpretations designed for multicultural assessment, practice in a multicultural context. I'm going to refer you to I'm going to refer you to Paniga and Yamata, to their book, that is the book on the handbook on multicultural mental health, for the specifics on that. What I want to talk about is to look at, there are 4 or more groups of diverse clientele throughout the world that clinicians are being asked to assess these days. It is now recognized that diversity extends beyond race and ethnicity to reflect characteristics or experiences related to gender, age, religion, disability, socioeconomic status, interracial, intercultural identities, indigenous populations, military personnel, and their families. Where I work, our students, we have students who do their internships on the Joint Base Lewis McChord Family Life Center, which is a military base. And of course, they bring their insights to the rest of the students in our group process from what it means to work with military families. And that is a whole different culture. So I know that among clergy, there are a number of people who come to be assessed for candidacy who either have a military background, or who who is looking to go into military chaplaincy. So you want to be aware of that. When you look at the different genders, the different characteristics of these diverse groups, again, you want to find out as much about them as you can. A general principle is, if you're working with a group, go into that community. If it's a military, if you are assessing people, and like when I was in Virginia, I did assessments for United Methodist clergy candidates when I was at VipCare, and there were people who were coming in. I did it for across Virginia, and so as you know, Virginia has a high military presence, and so fortunately, I had been a military chaplain, so I was fine. But had I not, I would have gone down to Norfolk and explored the base, spent time talking to soldiers and listening to them, spent time talking to commanders and listening to them. If you're working with Asian population, depending on which one it is, go into the Asian community, the particular Asian community of your client, and walk around, talk to people, and get a view of what that is. And whatever the culture is, get some sense of the culture so that when you make assessments, you can make assessments. I'm going to summarize a lot of, I'm going to do this before I summarize. All right. To explore the universality of internalized oppression of marginalized groups in the U.S. and corresponding mental health and psychological manifestations as they relate to multicultural assessments. You want to look at the universality. You will see in a chapter in David's book, which is called Internalized Oppression, the Psychology of Marginalized Groups. You will see that there's a lot of research that's been done on internalized oppression and how people across the world who have been subject to oppression have internalized that have internalized that oppression. And so you want to listen for internalized oppression. You want to read this particular reference to begin to understand the dynamics and the limits of internalized oppression. And so, thus endeth the presentation that I have today as you look at the overall multicultural context. Thank you very much.